Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the One in the Many videocast. My name is Rob Guzman. How are you? I'm doing well. So, for those of you new to the show or checking this out for the first time, as usual, what I do is I take the headlines from the week in the news and I distill it and discuss it in a principled fashion to try to discern what are the main ideas driving our culture. And this week we had quite a few things happening. So, we'll see how many things we can get in. But I want to discuss at least 3 things. We might discuss 4, but let's get started. So, right off the bat, let's talk about the most recent stuff happening first. So, this last Saturday, yesterday, in fact, we had a shooting in Pittsburgh. A man who is essentially a neo-Nazi went and killed 11 Jewish people at a bris ceremony, which is a ceremony where you name a baby in the Jewish tradition. He injured several police officers. He was apprehended and charged. I guess on social media he was going through saying how much he hated the Jews, how much he thought Jews were basically controlling the media and the internet, and he even said that the Jews were controlling President Trump. So this guy wasn't really a Trump supporter. He wasn't really a Democrat or a Republican. He seemed to be a complete nut. And the media are going crazy about how this is a resurgence of anti-Semitism. A related story that happened before that, I say it's related, and I'll explain why I think it's related, is the mailing of several explosive devices, pipe bombs, to several prominent Democrats. So Obama, Hillary, and Bill Clinton, Eric Holder, Cory Booker, even Robert De Niro, not a Democratic politician, but an outspoken Democrat in Hollywood, all received devices that were crude pipe bombs that looked like they could explode with fragments of glass. Now, none of these devices exploded. However, they did apprehend the person who they think is responsible. A guy who lived in Florida, had this really absurd, ludicrous Trump-mobile, like a car full of Trump bumper stickers and pictures. I guess he had a pretty checkered history. He was a former stripper, self-professed Native American, has a history of violence, and seems to be kind of off his rocker as well. So these are 2 very prominent examples of recent violence, and people in the media are linking it to politics per se. I don't know if that's right. I wouldn't say that it's really rhetoric of politicians that are driving violence like this. I think that it's deeper. I think what ends up happening is people resort to violence when they think that their views are right and they are unable to persuade their opponents with reason. So when I see someone using violence to reach a political objective, what that tells me is they've basically cast aside any rhetoric, argument, any kind of attempts to convey their message peacefully. So that, I think, is a sad development, but I think it's a development that we've seen in the United States for many years. I think it waxes and wanes with political feeling in this country. And I think we'll see more of it before we see less of it, but I think that it's deeper than just Trump or just the Democrats advocating for violence. And let's not forget that ultimately, at the end of the day, anyone who commits a violent act, it's their responsibility. They're the ones who did it. Nobody forced them to do it. No one brainwashed them or programmed them to do it. They did it. They chose to do it. And it could be that they're crazy. It could be they're off their rocker. They need to be medicated, whatever it is. But let's just try, all of us, to be civil and use political discourse and rhetoric and argument and not force. Because force cannot change minds. It can only destroy minds. It can only kill people. You can't forcefully convince somebody to believe the way you do. All you can do is stifle their judgment and force them to basically pretend that they agree with you. So let's take a lesson from that. That's all I really want to say about these issues. They're not really philosophic in nature. They're concrete issues that point to an underlying philosophic issue, but they themselves are not really ideas. So there's not really much to discuss on this show. What I do want to discuss, which has a little bit more of an philosophic and ideological content to it, let's start by next talking about the caravans, or the caravan, singular. So this last week, there were a large number of Hondurans leaving Honduras, going through Mexico and trying to reach the United States. Now, the number has waxed and waned. It usually goes between 3,000 and 5,000 people from the reports that I've read. People kind of join these caravans and then leave them. So there's kind of this weird little equilibrium thing going on. What we know is that these people are leaving a country that's one of the most violent countries in the world. Honduras is very high on the list of violent countries per capita. It also has the distinction of being one of these Latin American governments that don't really believe in individual rights. They're tyrannical governments. And as far as I know, it's really run by gang warfare. People there can't really start businesses. They can't really engage in trade and live their lives, so they're looking for a better place. Now, they're going through Mexico, and their aim is to reach the United States. And Trump, of course, has called this an invasion. A lot of conservatives are saying this is something that we need to stop. We need to prevent them from reaching the U.S. border. They've enjoined Mexico to stop them and say, you have to go through Mexico, seek asylum in Mexico first, and then maybe you'll talk about getting into America. So this is actually a microcosm of the larger immigration issue, which is an issue I haven't really discussed in this program. So I want to give my thoughts on immigration generally and sort of relate it to this issue of the caravan. So let's kind of start with what immigration is, right? So immigration is the practice of picking up your stuff and moving to another place, right? It's done for a number of reasons. People do it because they're unhappy with the environment they're in. It's done because maybe they're fleeing justice. There's refugees and immigrants who are criminals and want to leave their country because they fear being arrested or killed. People flee totalitarian and authoritarian regimes where they can't be happy. Like, let's say if you were in Nazi Germany or Soviet Union, you want to get out. That's why they put a wall in East Germany to keep people from leaving. And then there's people who basically just see opportunity. They don't have a horrible life, but they could see a better life in the other country they're moving to. So they decide, let's pick up and leave and try our luck somewhere else. So when it comes to immigration, sort of as a principle, I think that I am very pro-immigration in the sense that I think that immigration is something that we should encourage. I think we need more people in this country who are willing to come and work and engage in voluntary trade and respect individual rights. I know, for example, my parents, my father and his whole family are immigrants from Cuba. I wouldn't be here if they weren't allowed to immigrate here. And they are very rights-respecting people. They were fleeing a communist tyranny, which is Cuba, which is still a communist tyranny. And they're coming to the United States, which is a capitalist utopia compared to Cuba. And they wanted to, get a job, start a family, and they did. It was a phenomenal story. I mean, they came speaking very little English, and they worked their way up. I mean, my grandfather worked as a bus driver. They worked on assembly lines, and they saved enough money to buy a house. They, all their kids learned English, went to school, got jobs, and started their own families. So it's really a tremendous success story. And that's really what we mean when we say living the American dream. It's coming here as an individual, fleeing a bad situation for a better one. And America really is, in that sense, a melting pot. And it really is, in that sense, a country that's sort of united by an idea, which is individual rights and capitalism and free trade and all the other things that go with it. Those things are all linked together. Now, one thing that I've heard, though, is that there's this really dissonant argument, even amongst objectivists and other people who share my political framework and philosophic framework, that immigration is kind of a different issue today because we have people coming in from countries that are not rights-respecting, and they don't intend to be rights-respecting here in the United States. They intend to take advantage of the large welfare system here in the United States. They want to take advantage of the great wealth that we have in this country. And to be fair to this viewpoint, our country has become more socialistic in the last few decades. I mean, it really started with the New Deal, but it's kind of accelerated after Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty, and even today with things like Obamacare. And, we'll discuss later in this video some of the things Democrats are trying to get pushed in the Senate and the House that are going to make this country even more socialistic and more of a nanny state. So if you're coming from a third world country that has no wealth and infrastructure, and you see all the free goodies that we're getting here in the United States that the government is taking from the rich and giving to everyone else, then that's kind of a lure. And it's not really luring the right kind of people, if you ask me. It's encouraging people to come who want free goodies. So I can understand that viewpoint. I think that there's truth to that viewpoint. I don't think that it's all the immigrants, but I think that it's a chunk of them, and I think that it's something to be concerned about. Now, when it comes to immigration in general, as I said, I'm a fan of legal immigration, and I'm a fan also of making it as easy as possible for people to come here, provided they are rights respecting. Now, you cannot read someone's mind at the border. You can't sit them down and figure out, are you a law-abiding citizen? Do you live in individual rights? And so on. You can interview them, and they can tell you what they think or what they want you to hear, but as far as how they live, you really need to see evidence of that firsthand, and you really can't once they come in the country. And a lot of times, they're coming from countries that don't have good records. They don't really keep track of their citizens and their crimes. They're often corrupt regimes themselves. So, what kind of information are you really getting from those countries? So I would say that my view on this is that if someone were to come in this country, I think the first thing they should do is sign a waiver saying they're not going to get any welfare, any recipient money from the government. They shouldn't be any recipients of any handouts. They're not going to be paying or receiving Social Security. They're not going to be receiving any benefits. I think that's point one. I think that kind of filters out the people who are here for free goodies. If you say you're not going to get the goodies, they're not going to come, right? So that's point one. Point two, I would say, is once they're here, I think it's within the government's interest to monitor them, have them check in every so often, have some kind of government supervising agency that can keep an eye on them, see where they're living, make sure they're still in good shape with their employer. That's another thing. I think that, if they're going to come here, they need to either have some kind of a sponsor, someone who's willing to have them stay with them in their home or live alongside them, or they should have a job lined up. Like if you're coming in from, say, Latin America or Europe or Asia or anywhere else, if you have a job lined up with an American company and you're planning on renting an apartment and getting a house or whatever it is, I think that should be totally allowed. And again, you can be a resident here and not have voting rights and not all the other rights that go with being a citizen. So I think that there is a way to fix immigration so that it has all of these criteria built in. But I think the really long-term thing we need to do, if you really want to make the problem of immigration go away, is to get rid of the welfare state. I think that's the number one. Now, Milton Friedman, who's a famous free market economist, had the same view and actually believed that we shouldn't have open immigration until we got rid of the welfare state. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that they're two separate things. I think you can have immigration and a welfare state, but the welfare state has to go. And you have to make sure that you're not making the welfare state worse by having immigrants receiving benefits from it. So I think that's a big concern. And it's not just welfare. I mean, there's also infrastructure, like when we build public transit, immigrants take advantage of that. Roads, they take advantage of that. Hospitals. I mean, in our country, we have law EMTALA, E-M-T-A-L-A. It's a law. That's the law that says that if you're ever in dire need of emergency medical health assistance, they have to treat you in an emergency room. They can't turn you away. That was a law signed under Ronald Reagan, and that's called EMTALA, and immigrants are subject to that as well. So if you're a terminally ill or very ill or not very healthy immigrant, and you're coming into the United States, and let's say you need medical help, you need a drug, or you need some kind of assistance, all you need to do is get to an emergency room, and then they'll take care of you. They can't turn you away. So I think all these things we need to basically fix if you really want to make the problem of immigration go away. Another thing I want to say about immigration, I think that a lot of the people on the left, all the socialists and the Marxists and the egalitarians, they claim to be in favor of immigration, but I think they're in favor of it for the wrong reason. They're in favor of it because it's the altruistic thing to do. The immigrants are the have-nots. They're coming in from a country with no money, they have no wealth, they have no opportunities, and so these are the have-nots. We need to basically sacrifice the people who have money and have prosperity to give to those people. And if you don't want to do that, well, you're not following altruism. So they are using this issue to sort of bludgeon the Republicans for not being consistent altruists, which they're not, which is totally valid to do, but it doesn't mean altruism is right. It doesn't mean that they're supporting this basically right idea for the wrong reasons. So, and one thing I want to point out too, to all you socialists out there who like to listen, or at least socialist sympathizers, that'll be nice. All you social democrats, that's a nice little buzzword for you. If you're kind of, inclined toward the Democrats, consider that a lot of these migrants are leaving what you would consider to be a paradise by your ideology. They're fleeing socialist tyrannies where government has gotten out of control, where it regulates, and it's an authoritarian system where they have no individual rights, no private property ownership. They're either coming from a fascist dictatorship, which is another form of socialism, or they're coming from a sort of Marxist dictatorship like Venezuela. So, I feel like a lot of the people who talk about this on the left, they can't help but deep down, I think, really hate these people in a way because they're kind of a living refutation that their system works. So that's all I have to say about that. I'm sure I'll talk more about immigration in future videos, but for now, as far as the caravan goes, I guess the principal thing to do is, as I said, in principle, they should be allowed to enter, but they should be allowed to enter legally by the laws. And I think that we should, in the end, change the laws if we don't like the way they're going. And of course, the long-run law should be get rid of the welfare state. So if you really don't like immigration, if it's really something that bugs you, and illegal immigration especially bugs you, that should be your target. The welfare state should be your target. So the next issue that I want to talk about, sorry, just going down and looking at my notes here, it's actually related to this in a way, and that is the issue of so-called cultural appropriation. Right? So how does this fit in? Well, let's think about a couple of headlines from the last couple of weeks. So for one thing, it's Halloween, or it will be Halloween on Wednesday. And every year, college campuses in the United States, particularly Ivy League institutions like Harvard and Yale, they put out sort of warnings and guidelines for their students about what they can and can't dress up as. So Halloween costumes are always a kind of culture war on campuses because you have people who are maybe libertarian, conservative, not leftists, and they want to dress up in edgy costumes. Like, in the past they dressed up like Harambe with the gorilla who died in the zoo. They dress up like, Elizabeth Warren, you get in full headdress and do the whole Native American thing, and then you put a little name tag, say, Elizabeth Warren, get wampum out of politics, like that kind of thing. Very politically incorrect, right? And I mean, people do this all the time, and it's not just that. I mean, it could even be something very innocent, like, for example, you want to be a cowboy. That's a stereotype, right? And people, are against that now. You can't dress like a cowboy. So there are more and more, every year, these rules get more and more onerous. They get more and more stringent. And they're really pretty authoritarian in their orientation. Now, it's all motivated around political correctness and this idea of what's called cultural appropriation. So Megyn Kelly, this is the other headline I wanted to discuss in relation to this, was fired from NBC last week because of comments she made on her show about people dressing in blackface. Now, blackface is a practice where white people would put on black makeup, pretend to be black people, and then basically act out embarrassing and often very damaging stereotypes about black people. Maybe like a stupid black person, or a criminal black person, a rapper, or whatever. And these were very common. These sort of minstrel shows, they used to call them. This is another variation. People would dress up in blackface to perform a minstrel show. And this was often a way to denigrate black people. And it was done in the late 19th century and even in the early part of the 20th century. So it's not that old. It's older than slavery. It's coexistent with slavery, but I would say it's a more recent development than slavery. And it kind of, before the Jim Crow era, was very common too. So Megyn Kelly said, well, what's the problem? These people are dressing up in costume. Halloween is supposed to be a holiday where you dress up as something you're not. And, I think at one point she said someone wanted to dress up like Diana Ross. And that person was white and Diana Ross is black. So she painted her face black so she could look like Diana Ross. And she said, well, what's the big deal? People in the past would dress up in blackface or whiteface or what have you. Now, I saw the full clip where she discussed this on her show. And I have to say, it was pretty innocuous to me. I found that the whole idea of dressing in blackface, in the context that she was talking about it, she wasn't celebrating it. She wasn't saying that it was always a good thing. She was saying that it's something that people did in the past. And if people want to do it in a different context, on a holiday once a year, then it should be okay. Now, I think this is the most reasonable viewpoint in the world. I think that it's totally out of context to say, on Halloween, if you're dressing up like a black person, you are therefore a racist. That is absurd. You have to remember the context. Context really matters. I mean, there are lots of things that people say, and in one context, it's perfectly benign. In another context, it's pretty threatening. So, for example, let's take a very simple phrase. Oh, I could kill you. You could say that to a friend or a little kid or somebody if they spill your coffee or they make fun of you in some way, they mock you, and you're just joking around, like, oh, I could kill you. And then there's a good laugh. Your inflection of your voice changes, your body language kind of changes, the environment and the context changes, and, it's clear that you're not being threatening. But if you say, I'm going to kill you, and you rush at the person, and you have maybe a knife in your hand or a weapon, or, you're, like going to grab a baseball bat or a log to hit them with or something, that's a very different context. That means that they actually probably want to do you harm. And it's the same thing here. I mean, if you're quoting somebody making a comment, or you're putting it in context and saying people used to say X, or they used to do this, and now they do it for different reasons, that's a very harmless thing. It's not someone who means ill. So somebody who wants to dress up like a black person because they want to be that character and make their costume look more lifelike on Halloween, which is a special event, special once-a-year event, that's not racism. That's actually trying to capture the essence of this person, what they objectively look like. That's what you're trying to achieve. If I were to dress up like, say, let's say I wanted to dress up like Michael Jackson or Michael Jordan or like Chris Rock or some other black figure, or if let's say we were doing Lethal Weapon, and I had a friend, and it was like he was going to be the Mel Gibson character, and I was going to be Danny Glover. I mean, if I wouldn't do this because I'm not particularly into dressing up, and I have no real reason to do it in this climate because it's, people blow their top. But if we were in a more rational culture and I wanted to look the part, like I wanted to look like Danny Glover, I'd paint my face black. I mean, that's totally reasonable. How else would they know who I was? How else would they know the character? If I'm taking a photo with the Mel Gibson character, you need to have two people, and it's not like I'm insulting all black people. If anything, I'm emulating Danny Glover's character. I'm paying him homage. And that's what this whole thing about cultural appropriation comes from. And I mean, just to finish off with Megyn Kelly's story, she was fired, but it was only after she got warned, and then almost overnight, it was like, she's going to get fired. And then she appeared on her show the next day, tearfully apologizing. And this is the most depressing thing in the world to watch. This is literally like someone being marched in front of the Politburo in the Soviet Union and apologizing for wanting to assassinate Stalin, even though they never wanted to do it. And Stalin just wants to take them out because they're a threat to his power. This is a show trial. It's a mockery. And I thought it was just disgusting to have somebody do that on public TV, to humiliate themselves and get on their knees and basically beg for forgiveness for something that isn't even a crime and in a rational culture wouldn't be seen as such. This comes from a very deep-seated idea that I discussed in my previous video on the idea that your race is not your culture. And that's what this is all about as well. Cultural appropriation isn't a valid concept because it essentially is linking together culture and race. Just because you have a particular skin color or you have a particular ethnicity or heritage doesn't mean you have, just because you have a certain race doesn't mean you have the culture that goes with that race. And just because you celebrate a culture that goes with a particular race doesn't mean you have to be that race. The whole idea that a group can claim ownership of a cultural practice. I mean, a cultural practice or a viewpoint or a belief is an idea, all right? It's a tradition. It's based on, ultimately, philosophy, but there's other considerations, and you can't trademark that for a group. Groups don't have that kind of leverage, and how do you identify who's in and who's out? I mean, if, let's say, you had this idea of, African culture, right? And it's like, okay, well, there was a controversy a few years ago at one of the colleges where a white girl was wearing hoop earrings, and a couple of racist black students decided to write on one of the campus walls in graffiti, white girl, take off your hoops because they're not yours, or, you shouldn't be allowed to wear hoop earrings because you're not black. And apparently hoop earrings are a black culture thing. Although that's actually false. They actually originated before that in the Mesopotamian region, so even that was borrowed, and they got that wrong because they're illiterate on their history too. But regardless, the point still stands. Just because she's black or she's not black doesn't mean she can't enjoy a fashion trend or a culture that celebrates certain things. It may look good on her and it may look better on a black girl, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still something that she can enjoy. I mean, whatever happened to the idea that emulation is the highest form of flattery, or imitation, I should say, is the highest form of flattery? That's really what this is about. If you have an idea that works, and a culture basically develops that idea to a point where it's a practice, and other cultures want to borrow from it because it's effective, why wouldn't you let them do that? They're basically celebrating your innovation. They're celebrating your achievement. Consider even the things you take for granted today. I mean, computers are definitely something that the West produced. Is it cultural appropriation for people in Africa, Latin America, or Asia to use computers? What about logic? Logic is a development out of Aristotle. That wouldn't have existed if it weren't for Aristotle's achievement. So Are you culturally appropriating Greek culture when you use the phrase, A is A, or things are what they are and do what they do, and you basically have all the logic that comes out of that? I mean, this is absurd. An idea is either true or false, and somebody can subscribe to it regardless of their race. And I think this whole debate about cultural appropriation is just another way to basically make people feel the worst psychological thing you can feel, which is unearned guilt. It's guilt for being who you are. It's basically attacking you for who you are and not what you choose to do. So I think that ultimately, cultural appropriation, it's got to go. I think, by the way, and you should never make it a polemic to try to attack the consistency of your opponent. Usually the opponent's going to just try to wriggle out of it. But there's kind of a contradiction here even on the left. I mean, on the one hand, they celebrate diversity, right? They say diversity is good because you have a plethora of ideas from different perspectives, right? That's their view of diversity. It's like if I have a black, an Asian, a white, and a Hispanic, that's great. And I should have a woman and a trans in there too, just to mix it up a little bit. And I have different perspectives, right? Well, if your whole point is to get those perspectives to be followed by people who don't share that perspective so that they understand it, isn't that in a way the opposite of cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation says that each person should stay in their own little niche, and you shouldn't venture out and try what other cultures do. So which is it? Is diversity good because you get the perspective of everybody there, and you should each share it and decide on what the best thing to do is? Or should each person be siloed in their own little bin based on their race and never venture out of it? Because it's disrespectful if they do. No one can make up their mind on this because there is no answer. This is irrationality, and with irrationality, as Ayn Rand once said, there's no end to it. So you have to be rational. That's the answer there. All right, so the last point I want to talk about, sorry, that was a long rant on cultural appropriation. I didn't think I'd have that much to say about it, but apparently I did. So the last topic I want to talk about is inequality. So inequality is another big issue that the left really likes to celebrate as a big electoral issue. It's a big problem. It's the problem that's facing our culture more now than ever before. It's inequality. It's the wealthy. It's the 1%. It's the fat cats at the top, taking all the wealth for themselves and leaving nothing for the bottom. And this is supposedly the big problem. So why am I bringing this up? Well, there are a couple of stories from last week that bring this issue to light. So I read an article last week, which I will link in the notes, saying that Silicon Valley, the region in California that's most responsible for software development and software companies, leads the country in income inequality. And this article goes on to say that 9 in 10 workers in the California region, known as Silicon Valley, saw income raise significantly since 1997, so they haven't really reaped the benefits that have come out of Silicon Valley. And a lot of those benefits, they say, go to the high-skilled tech workers, so the high-skilled programmers and IT professionals. So this article goes on to say that most of the profits for tech companies accrue to the most skilled tech workers. So that's what this article said. And related to that, the article proposes a couple of fixes. It says, well, we need to have more corporate taxes. We need to have corporate housing or government housing for people in low-income areas that come out of taxing the rich. And we should have more laws that allow people to organize labor unions in tech, so you can have tech labor unions. And we need higher labor standards. That was the phrase, the weasel word phrase in the article. So that article was sort of one instance of this I read last week. Another instance was the Democrats, specifically Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, advocating for legislation. And there were a few others in there that a few other Democrats in the House that were pushing this idea that they want to give working families, I love the language games the left play. It's just, they are geniuses at manipulating language to make whatever they're proposing sound good. It's just outlandish. It's, like earlier I talked about sweatshops, right? Oh, they're bad, sweatshops. And, now we're talking about working families. How can you be against working families? What kind of monster are you? Anyway, what Kamala Harris of California wants to do is she wants to give a tax credit, a $6,000 a year tax credit to families who fill out their tax returns if they make less than $100,000 a year. So the government would give them either a lump sum at the end of the year when they fill their taxes, or they would get monthly payments, monthly installments. So it would supplement their income. And one Democrat said in the article that described this, quote, "The idea was to provide a clear contrast with Donald Trump. You know what you could actually do with this money? You could give anyone making under $75,000 a raise." So this is a giveaway program. Let's give working families that make less than a certain amount every year money. Let's supplement their income with government money. And that'll help their situation. Why? Because they don't have as much as the wealthy. And the wealthy can afford it. They can spare it. Cory Booker was another Democrat, pushed a similar idea, only a little different, actually a little bit more radical. He said that every human, every person born in the United States should have an account opened up in their name with the government. And as soon as they're born, they get $2,000 deposited. And then every year after that, the government would deposit another $1,000 every year until they're 18. That way, when they are old enough to start worrying about college and maybe buying a house, they can have some nest egg, some money to sort of shop around with, something to get them started with, right? So that was Cory Booker's idea. So we got, Silicon Valley leads the country in income inequality, how terrible that is. We've got Democrats with their giveaway programs. And we've got one more thing I wanted to talk about, which I'll also link in this video, which is a little bit more of an intellectual data point, but it's still very revealing nonetheless. It was an Economist article that actually reviewed a book. Now this book, the title of this book is called The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century. It's by a guy named Walter Schneidel, right? Now, you may ask, Rob, why do I care about what The Economist says about some obscure book by some obscure author? Well, you should care, because as I try to make this point over and over again in this show, and as I try to, the whole point of me doing this show is to demonstrate the power of ideas, that ideas are inherent in everything you do, and that philosophy is a motivating factor for everything you do, so ultimately. And so it is the philosophic ideas in the culture that decide what the next political developments are going to be, what the next technological developments are going to be, what the next religious and social developments are going to be, and so on. So if you don't pay attention to this stuff when it's in its early phases, you're going to miss out and be at a loss as to how we end up 5 years from now with a socialist government or worse, right? You can't get much worse than that, but this is what I'm saying. So this book, its purpose is to document the history of inequality. So it goes back to the Stone Age, which I don't know how you can even get data really for that. A lot of it's probably inference from, cave paintings and, maybe fossils and relics, who knows. But anyway, they go back that far. And of course, as you get closer to the 20th century, there's more evidence, there's more data. You can kind of look at government records, you can look at books and journals written by people in firsthand. This guy is studying the history of inequality. So what's the thesis of this book that's being reviewed by The Economist? Well, it's that inequality is a problem, and there's only four things that can really, or I should say one thing that takes four different forms that can really end inequality, and that is disasters. Bad, traumatic things happening to the human race is really the only way to fight income inequality. So the author says, now this is the reviewer who's reading this book and commenting on it, and this is one of the quotes. I'm going to quote extensively from this article because I think that it's so revealing and it's just so egregious in its message. Here's one quote. So, quote, "As a supplier of momentary relief, the Great Depression seems an unlikely candidate. But when it turns up on page 363 of Walter Schneidel's book, it feels oddly welcome. For once, and it's only once, for no other recession in American history boasts the same achievement, real wages rise and the incomes of the most affluent fall to a degree that has a powerful impact on economic inequality," unquote. So, right away, just to recap what that says, it says we should celebrate the Great Depression. Why? Not because essentially it tore down the wealthy. It brought them down to a level where income inequality was almost nil. Everybody was poor. We lost all this wealth. We had this horrible stock market crash. People couldn't feed themselves very much. They had no jobs. Consumer goods went way down. Widespread pain and misery for anyone who lived during this period, whether you were wealthy or poor. It affected everybody. And they said, yeah, that's a good thing. That's a good thing because inequality was low. Now, this is just despicable, beyond the pale, but I got to give you some more. It gets worse, believe it or not. So the reviewer goes on to say that in the book, the author says there's only 4 things that really historically fought income inequality. Epidemics and plagues, like the Black Death. Collapse of whole states and civilizations, like the fall of the Roman Empire. Total revolutions, like China's Cultural Revolution under Mao, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And total war, so World War II. That's it. Those are the only things that can really end income inequality. And the author is quoted as saying, when everyone is pauperized, the rich lose the most. The rich lose the most. Isn't that a wonderful thing? The Black Death really did us all a favor because it ended income inequality for a good 100 years. I mean, it's almost like you can't make this stuff up, but it goes on. Here's what the author says. Again, this is from the review. I'll quote this. Quote, catastrophic levelings will be less likely in the future. Pandemics are a real risk, but plagues similar in impact to the Black Death are not. Nor are total revolutions and wars fought over years by armies of millions. On top of that, since the Industrial Revolution, general prosperity, regardless of income inequality, has risen. And in past decades, global inequality has somewhat fallen. This is good news in general, but news which leaves readers who would like to see significantly less unequal income inequality in a bit of a pickle, unquote. Did you get that? So, plagues are just not as common as they used to be. And wars, they're not really fought as often as they used to be, and they're not as bloody right now. And, global income inequality has somewhat fallen, but more importantly, the Industrial Revolution brought prosperity. So even poor people in the United States, even the poorest of the poor in the United States, live better than upper class people in Africa and Latin America. That's a fact. But if you really want income inequality to go down, that puts you in a pickle, doesn't it? Oh yeah, and it's a rotten and smelly pickle at that. Now, last quote from this article, and then I'm going to comment on this extensively, as well as all the previous things I just said. Quote, if history provides no support for thinking that deep, peaceful reduction of income inequality is possible, perhaps progressives, this is me, this is Marxists, should set themselves other tasks, unquote. Now, this last is pretty ominous in my mind because it's ambiguous. What does he mean? Does he mean that peaceful income inequality reduction is not possible, so you should give up on it and move on to another issue? Well, that's one reading of that. Another reading of that is, well, if you still think that you want income inequality and there's no peaceful way to get it, maybe your other task is to try non-peaceful means. Revolutions. Try to start a plague up. Maybe drum up a war somewhere. Try to collapse a country. So this article, I should say, is the philosophy that fuels the democratic giveaway programs, and it is the same sentiment that explains somebody writing an article about how horrible income inequality is in Silicon Valley. The basic driving factor behind all of these points, there's one really underlying thread, and that is egalitarianism, which I talked about in the prior video last week. The idea that equality per se is good regardless of how it comes about. Equality is the standard of justice, and if things are not equal, they should either be made equal by force if necessary, and if complete equality can't be achieved, if there's always going to be some ambient inequality, then you have to at least pretend they're equal, and if you acknowledge there are differences, that makes you a moral criminal. So it's egalitarianism all the way down, but it's also envy. It's envy of people who have done well, and it's envy of those who have worked and attained greatness and achieved great things, created wealth. Let's go in order. So, people in Silicon Valley, right? Well, consider that income isn't the only standard by which you assess someone's well-being. Our society has risen in its standard of living tremendously as a result of businessmen particularly tech entrepreneurs who invest great amounts of time, effort, and money into building better products. We wouldn't have the internet the way it is today. We wouldn't have iPhones. We wouldn't have laptops. We wouldn't have all the wonderful tech devices and apps. Think about all the apps you use on a daily basis, whether it's Amazon to buy products, whether it's Google to look for questions that you have, whether it's a map app so you can travel from one place to another without a paper map, whether it's a bank where you're able to deposit your money and withdraw it electronically without going to the actual branch, whether it's a word processing application where you're writing out something for your job, whether you're an application developer, you're a coder, and this is something where you can basically open up a file and write in almost English and have a computer understand what you're saying, which is all basically decoded in bits and bytes at the end of the day without you having to do anything about that. I mean, it's limitless. It's limitless. Think about all the healthcare implications. Think about things like MRI devices. Think about all the drugs that are made. Think about all of the wonderful devices that have been created, all because of technology and tech entrepreneurs who invest their money and their brilliance into building these products. So just because a worker in Silicon Valley hasn't seen an actual income rise in the last 10 years or so, or 20 years, that doesn't mean their life hasn't improved immeasurably, and it has. So that's the first point, is that these studies that say that, the top 10% or the top 1% of workers or the big fat cats get all the gains because their income has gone up and no one else's has, well, that's ridiculous, because everybody's standard of living goes up under a capitalist society, under a free market. And that's what's actually happened. We've actually seen that in our lifetime. This isn't just a matter of comparing my life today with someone in the 30s or someone in the 50s. This is a matter of me comparing my life today in 2018 with my life in 2008 and in 1998. And I've seen it in my lifetime, and I'm only 31 years old. So if you're 40, 50, or older, you have seen it in your lifetime as well, and you've seen it on a massive scale. And it's not that this comes out of government or comes out of the blue. This is individual entrepreneurs and people with skills using those skills. So that's point one. Point two is, giving somebody something from the government is not like, it's not like it comes out of thin air. These giveaway programs that Booker and Harris want to put forward, like the comment of the Democrats saying we could give that person a raise. Well, there's an important difference between an actual raise and a subsidy from the government, right? An actual raise occurs when your value to the company is such that they want to pay you more for your services. It is something you've earned. It's something that benefits you and benefits your employer. They are rewarding you for a job well done. And they wouldn't hire you for the salary they're paying you if it didn't mean something competitively. Every time I go into my office and I code something and I get a paycheck at the end of the month or whatever it is, that's my company paying me for my services. They get more from my services than the money they pay, and I get more out of the money that I get paid than the services I render. It's an equal trade for equal gain on both sides. So that's the big difference. If I get, say, $75,000 a year as a salary from my boss, and then the government comes and chips in another $6,000 every year, well, it's not just that my income has gone up. What's actually happened is I've earned $75,000. The other $6,000 is taken by force from somebody else, someone who earned their money, and it's given to me not because I earned it or deserve it, but because I'm poor, because I have less, because I'm not equal. And yet again, this is egalitarianism. It's egalitarianism, and it's basically targeted at the greatest of the great developers, entrepreneurs, the great achievers, the high flyers in our society. This is hatred of the good for being the good. So again, the left, the Democrats, this is their politics, and it's based on the same sentiments that we read in the article. Now, I'm going to link all this stuff. I'm going to link the article from The Economist. I'm going to link the information about the tax cut stuff and how they want to repeal the tax cuts and do these giveaway programs. And I'm going to also link another article that's on medium.com, which not only does a pretty good job of attacking not the philosophy of the whole thing, which is what I've done here, but they kind of go into where these statistics about falling and rising income are actually flawed. So one thing the article mentions that I'll just briefly mention here is that these studies that study inequality are actually pretty terrible from a scientific perspective as well. They don't do a good job of keeping their variables fixed. So for one thing, it's one thing to say that if I study all the poor that live in America today and compare them to all the poor in the 80s and all the poor in the 70s, well, I'm getting a snapshot of the economy at 3 different points in time. But the people in those demographics aren't the same people. If you really want to know what it's like in America to live in a country with a relatively free market, what you should do is pick a group of people who are in the poor class today and see where they are 10 years from now, 20 years from now. What ends up happening is most people who start out poor, and by the way, everyone starts out poor. You're born with not a cent to your name. And in fact, even if your parents have money, you don't even have clothes on your back. You've got nothing. In fact, the only thing you have is by the grace of your parents who take care of you and are responsible for you until you're old enough to live and earn your own money. But everybody starts out as zero. You don't come out of the womb with a sack of money. That's not how it works. Everybody starts out at zero. And they may get benefits from their parents and their earlier ancestors, but ultimately the success that they achieve in their life is up to them. Because great fortunes are often lost overnight. All you need to do is look at the Forbes Top 100 list every year. Compare what the top companies are today with 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. You'll see that they change. They shift all the time. IBM is a great example. In our lifetime, IBM was a titan in the computing industry, and now it's been displaced. So this happens. It's not like you're born with money and the government should give you more. It's you have to earn your way in life, and you can get the tools early in life to help you, and it will influence your actions one way or the other. But fundamentally, it's on you to basically see that you end up successful. So these studies don't do that. They basically just say, today let's look at the poor. Oh, okay, they make this much. Let's look tomorrow at the poor. Oh, they still make this much. This is bad. We're falling behind, etc., and so forth. But what about all the people that are no longer in that class? They've moved on. They're now middle class or upper class. And the people who you're studying now, compared to like 10 years ago or 5 years ago, well, that's a different group of people. They're younger. They're starting out. So yeah, you're going to see. There's always going to be a bottom. There's another way to look at this, right? There's always going to be a bottom in any distribution. The key isn't that there's always a bottom. That's a fact. The key is that what happens to the people in the bottom, the individual people in the bottom, and what happens to them over time. And you'll see that individuals in America overwhelmingly move up, particularly if they're young and they're poor, because they start out poor and they work their way up to middle or upper class over the span of their lives. So the Medium article I will link goes over in more detail why these studies are flawed. Another thing they don't do is they don't account for the fact that most companies, they have healthcare benefits, they have perks. I mean, look at another thing. Most people who work from home today, it's a more and more common phenomenon that people can remote into their office if they work in an office. I know I can, and that's only possible because my company invests in an infrastructure that allows me to do that. They invest in an IT infrastructure that gives us a VPN. They give us laptops or phones so we can dial in. These are costs, right? They don't show in my income. But if I can work from home 1 or 2 days a week, or let's say I have a kid and they're sick and I can't go into the office, but I can remote in because of something the company has purchased that allows me to do that, how do you put that in economic terms? You really can't, right? That's a perk, that's a benefit that people would pay for if they had to, but the money amount is going to vary from person to person. I mean, it's very naive the way they do these studies. So I would say the big principle here, there's 2 big principles. First of all, well, a minor principle and a major principle. And then we'll end it because this video is pretty long. The minor principle is be suspicious of all these kind of policy wonks who put out all these papers and talk about statistics. It's very easy to lie with statistics. I was an applied math major. I know all the tricks of the trade. It's very easy to lie with statistics. One reason is because they drop context. They drop context and they favor aggregates over individual data points, and they explain away anomalies as outliers. So they're actually, I'm not a big fan, even though I majored in it, I'm not a very big fan of statistics for that reason. I think that they're very misleading without a context to put them in. The other thing is the major principle to take away is consider this obsession with income inequality and ask, is this really the right thing to do? If I'm reading an article by The Economist and it's studying a book or reviewing a book about income inequality in history, and one of the conclusions is that the Black Death or World War II or the Great Depression was a good thing, something is wrong with your ideology. Something is wrong with your value system. Something is wrong with your premises. And the thing that is wrong is this idea that equality is good per se. It's not. Equality is something that is good in a political context when it comes to rights, but it's not good in a metaphysical context where people are different. They have different skills, they have different capabilities, and justice requires that people get rewarded for what they do and what they produce. So in other words, achievement, not need. Okay, that's the takeaway here. So anyway, that's all I have to say for today. Have a great week. Enjoy Halloween. If you haven't gone trick-or-treating, it's on the 31st. Celebrate it. Go out, culturally appropriate, dress up however you like. Don't let the PC fascist police shut you down. And I'll see you next time. Bye.